Hey everyone, in this video we're going to take a look at chapter 28 from book 5 of Caesar's De Bello Gallico. Now remember, at this part of the narrative we're still kind of in the beginnings of Ambiorix's revolt, and we're really centered on this fort in that northeast part of Belgium, right? We have Sabinus and Cotta. In the last chapters we saw that Ambiorix had showed up at the fort. He delivered a speech, right? That big long indirect statement where Caesar is kind of reporting what he heard that Ambiorix has said, and it's all basically a trick, right? So he's giving them suggestions of what they should do, and all of it is to lure them out of the fort, okay? So in this chapter, what we're going to see is what happens afterwards, right? The debate on what the Romans should do, and Caesar's going to focus in on his commanders, specifically Sabinus and Cotta, and really point the finger at them of what they did and what they should do. Now, before you dive too far into it, like I always tell you in these videos, the first thing you want to do is make sure that you do a little pre-reading, right? Try to learn the vocab as best you can. There's a bunch of different ways you can do that, different commentaries, things like that, Quizlets. There's a lot online. But try to at least understand what the words are, right? That's sort of half the battle. If you have no clue what the words are, you're going to have a really tough time reading this, no matter how good you are at the grammar. The other thing you want to do is find a partner in class, a classmate, whoever, someone you can read this to, right? You don't want to just translate it in your head. I know I always say in the AP class where this is usually read, it can be a lot of pressure to really move through the material. But if you really want it in your long-term memory, try reading it out loud, right? Practice your speaking, your pronunciation, and then have your classmate read it back to you so you can work on your listening skills. That's really a good way to make sure that you're engaging all parts of your brain to learn the Latin and not just memorize it in the short term. The other thing I'd encourage you to do is the read and reread method, right? So read through the story, write the chapter. Whenever it comes time to translate, read through it and just keep a list on the side, right? Of anything you don't understand. Maybe it's vocab or grammar, whatever it is. Make a list. When you're done with the entire chapter, go back and look at where you went wrong, right? So if it's words you didn't know, it's probably vocab. That's easy, right? Just look them up, maybe make a Quizlet or something to help you with these troublesome words. Make sure you kind of lock those up. You're ready for the next read. If it's grammar, look through a commentary. There's a bunch of them out there, right? Maybe it's just something you missed. You could try doing it on your own. If you get stuck, feel free to pick up any of the dozens of commentaries. You can find some free online, just things that will help you through it and give you notes to help you with the translation. Whenever you feel like you're in a good place, you repeat that process. And on the second, third, fourth time, as many times as you need to, right, your list should get shorter and shorter and shorter. And eventually you'll be able to read through this entire chapter without any help, without needing to pause or try to make sense of something. And you understand the vast majority, if not all of it. That's how you know you're in a really good place to move on. And you've probably locked that into your long-term memory. And you're really understanding the Latin, not just memorizing it for a test or something like that, okay? So if you've done all that, or if you haven't done all that, rather, pause the video, go work on it. Otherwise, let's keep moving forward, right? I'll translate it with you. And as long as what you're doing is somewhere in the region of mine, my translation is never the be-all, end-all, but at least it'll be something that can kind of guide you through to make sure that you're on the right track, okay? So the chapter starts like this. You have Arpaneus et Junius quae audierunt ad legatos deferent. Okay, so remember, we had just ended, this long indirect statement of Ambiorix in his speech to the fort, right? So you have Arpaneus and Junius. Those are the two men who listened to Ambiorix's speech. Okay, and it says they report to the legates the things which they had heard, right? So the quae there is neuter substantive plural, right? So the things which. Audierunt is really a shortened version of audiverunt, right? They heard. So the main verb here is Arpaneus and Junius, right? They deferent, they reported, ad legatos, to the legates, to the commanders, the things which they heard. So in other words, they hear Ambiorix and they come back to the camp, and they tell what they heard. Then you have the next line, or part of the next line. You have illi repentina re perturbati etsi ab hoste ea dicebantur tamen non negligenda ex systemabant maximeque hac re permovebantur. Okay, so you have illi, meaning these men, having been disturbed, right, perturbati, right, having been kind of disturbed by this sudden thing, the repentina re, right, this sudden event, right? And so they are kind of unsettled by Ambiorix's speech. And Caesar puts a side note here and says, although, right, etsi, it was said, or these things, rather, ea, these things were said, dicebantur, by an enemy. Okay, so that's an interesting line. He's saying they were nervous, even though these were said by an enemy, right? He's saying you should have never taken Ambiorix's word for it. So Caesar's already injecting a little bit of commentary and some judgment, saying, I can't believe these two guys were fooled by this speech. Okay, you have, however, existimabant, right? They judged. And then you have here the passive periphrastic, right? You have the gerundive there, the negligenda, going with the implied essay here, okay? So it's saying, although or however, they judged that they, right, it's talking about them, must not be neglected, negligenda. So again, this is sort of a roundabout way of talking, right? The periphrastic. But that's what's happening here when you have that the gerundive plus sum, some version of sum, right? So again, the translation there, it's really talking about the subject is really this implied ea, right? The things that they must not be neglected means like that they don't be ignored. So in other words, they're disturbed by these things, even though an enemy said them, right? But they judged ex sistimabant, right? They judge that they shouldn't be ignored. In other words, they believe Ambiorix here. Okay. And they were especially moved, Maxime, right? They were especially moved by this thing, this affair, hoc re. Okay, so again, Caesar's saying that like this whole affair, this whole thing with Ambiorix, even though they shouldn't have believed him, they're nervous about it, right? They're all unsettled, right? Permoebantur, perturbati, right? We're seeing that same idea of being disturbed or kind of moved by something. Okay. Then we go to the end of the line. We finish it. You have quod civitatem ignobilem, atque humilum eburonum sua sponte popolo Romano bellum facere ausam vix erat credendum. Okay. So you have quote here that, right? Or because, however you want to do it, right? The main verb is another passive periphrastic. It's erat credendum or credendum erat, right? There's your gerundive. You're going with the verb to be, right? Your form of sum. So in other words, in this one, again, it's the same form that we just saw. And it means something like it was to be believed is kind of one way to translate that. Now, the wix there means barely or scarcely, right? So you're saying that it was barely able to be believed that a civitatem ignobilem, right, a state low, right, ignoble, right, maybe is a better way to do it, and humilem, that's probably low, right, such a lowly and ignoble state of the Eburones, right, that this state, this group, the Eburones, because they're so ignoble and low, by its own will, right, or by their own will, it's really talking about the state, though, by its own will. And then you have ausam there. Now, the ausam is really ausam esse, right? You're implying that esse there. So it's a perfect infinitive, a deponent infinitive. So it's coming from audeo audere, this semi-deponent verb that means to dare. So you can translate ausam esse as had dared, right? So it was barely able to be believed, right? That's such a lowly and sort of ignoble state as the Eburones on their own will, or by their own will rather, had dared to make war on the Roman people, right? So in other words, I'm saying who would ever believe that they would actually do this because they're such a low state. So again, Caesar's setting up this like confusion, right? Who's going to believe this? What's going on here, right? There's not a clear sense of what's actually happening and what they're supposed to do with what Ambiorix told them. So then you continue, you have itaque ad consilium rem deferunt, magnaque inter eos existit controversia. Okay, so you have, and so they brought back, deferent, right? They brought to the council, ad concilium, this rem, right? This situation. They brought the situation to the council. Now, the concilium there is talking about the group of military leaders that would sort of gather and discuss what they should do. So when Caesar's saying the council, it's talking about Sabinus, Cotta, all the sort of leaders. And you're going to see in a second, he'll lay them, kind of lay out who's part of this council. So they bring the situation to them, and among them, inter eos, mean among the council, there arises, existed, right? There exists or there arises a magna controversia, right? A great controversy. They're not in agreement about what they should do at this moment. Okay. Then you have Lucius Aurunculeius, comploresque tribuni militum et primorum ordinum centuriones nihil temere agendum neque ex hibernis in iusu, Caesaris discendendum existimabant. Okay, so we start by having Lucius Aurunculeius. Now, you want to remember that in the description Caesar's giving, he's using their different names. Lucius Aurunculeius here is Cotta, right? One of the leaders. You have Sabinus and Cotta. So it's really Cotta and several tribunes, right? Tribuni there, tribunes of the soldiers. Okay, so they have Cotta, several of the tribunes of the soldiers, and centuriones, centurions of the first rank. Okay, so these are some pretty powerful people in the council, right? You have Cotta and these big these leaders, right? That's kind of what's going on. So they existimabant, they thought that. So again, we're setting up the indirect statement. Okay. So the next phrase here is nihil temere agendum esse. Now, agendum esse there, again, is passive paraphrastic. We keep seeing the same thing. So that's usually translated should be done. Okay, so they thought that nihil, nothing, should be done temere, rashly. Okay, so in other words, they're saying let's not kind of dive into all this. Okay, so nothing should be done rashly, nor should they depart, discedendum esse, right? So again, we keep going down here. You have the same thing happening again. You can translate it. It literally means something like it must not be departed. I guess is kind of the more literal way you do it. But the translation you want to do is that they must not depart, right? That's really how you want to translate it. So they judged or they thought that nothing should be done rashly, nor should they depart from Hibernis, right? Ex Hibernis, from their winter quarters. In usu is usually translated without order, right? Without the order of Caesar, okay? So again, Caesar's reporting here that there's not agreement on what they should do, but Cotta and a bunch of the leaders are saying, hey, we shouldn't do anything, right? Let's not do anything without explicitly getting commands from Caesar. And again, this is kind of an interesting line to me anyway, because you have to remember Caesar is reporting what happened. So notice how he says, don't do anything without talking to Caesar first. That's kind of a nice way of making yourself look good. It almost implies like, hey, if they had just listened to these guys and waited for Caesar, everything would have been fine. So I think that's an interesting way that he writes it here, where he puts himself in saying, yeah, see, I told you, if you had just waited for me, I would have told you this was stupid. That's kind of the implication in all this, okay? Then you have quantasuis magnas etiam copias Germanorum sustinere posse munitus Hibernis docebant. So again, the docebant there, a lot of times in sort of the early textbooks, you'll see this as they taught. And it can also mean like they sort of like showed or pointed out or thought or said. It's got that same sort of meaning to it. So they thought or they pointed out that you have copias, right? So the troops, and etiam, even troops, however much, right? Quantasuis, however so great, right? Even troops of the Germans, Germanorum, were able, right? Posse, because again, you have the indirect statement here, were able to be sustained, meaning like held off or repelled in munitis Hibernis, in fortified winter quarters. So in other words, they're saying, even if Ambiorix is true, right? He's telling the truth. And this giant band of Germans are coming. No matter how many troops they roll out, they're saying we're able to hold them off because we're sitting in a fortified camp, right? We have the walls up. We have enough troops. We'll be able to hold them off. So that's sort of the logic, again, of not leaving. Then you continue of rem esse testimonio, quod primum hostium impetum multis ultro vulneribus ilatis fortissime sustinuerent, re frumentaria non premi. So the first part here, the rem esse testimony is a little bit sort of odd, right? Oddly worded. You have, again, they're kind of showing that the situation was esse, right? The situation was for evidence, you might say, for testimony, testimonio. I believe it's the dative of purpose here. So you can almost say that I think in some commentaries they say it served as evidence, right, for the purpose of evidence. That's a pretty good way to do it. So the situation was for evidence, or you could say the situation served as evidence, right, for this whole thing. And you have quote here, because, right? Or you might even say it's in apposition, so you might even say like, namely, because, and he's going to give the reason of what situation is kind of serving as evidence that they shouldn't move, okay? And they said they, meaning the troops, sustinuera, they sustained the primum impetum hostium, the first attack of the enemy. So they're saying, look, we already, sustained and upheld ourselves against the first attack of the enemy, which is true. Remember, they get ambushed and they're able to fight them off. So like, we've already done this once. So that's sort of the evidence they're giving. Now, the fortissime there is probably going with sustinuera, right? They had bravely sustained the first attack of the enemy. Ultro there is moreover. So moreover with multis vulneribus, with many wounds having been inflicted. So they're saying like, not only did we sustain this first attack, right, from our fort, but we also killed a bunch of them, right? So he's saying we already kind of dealt out a lot of wounds ourselves. We're fine, okay? So saying we should be able to handle this, okay? Then you have the re frumentaria non premi, right? Premi, rather. So he's saying that not only all this, but they're not oppressed, right, by the supply of grain, the re frumentaria, right, the situation of grain, you might say, but usually the grain supply is really what you want to do. So he's saying not only that, but we're not in trouble in terms of food. We have enough food. We've already held off their first attack. Why would we leave the fort? And this is really the right answer, right? And Caesar's kind of setting it up that way. You read this, you're like, yeah, why would you leave the fort? So it's going to make it a little more drastic when in the next few chapters you see they actually do leave the fort, right? So again, you want to read this and remember that Caesar's reporting this in a very specific way, okay? Then you have interea et ex proximis hibernis et a Caesare conventura subsidia. Postremo quid esse levius aut turpius quam auctore hoste de summis rebus capere consilium, right? So there's a question that gets asked sort of at the end of this. So now we continue again what they're pointing out. So you have meanwhile, right, they're showing, it's back to that dokebon, that subsidia, help, right, assistance, conventura there is really conventura esse, okay? So it's a future infinitive. So you can translate it as help would come. Convene is kind of one way you see it in different commentaries. Either way, right? Help would convene or help would come by Caesar, right? So it's saying it's going to come from, or rather from the proximis hibernis, from nearby winter quarters and from Caesar or by Caesar. So in other words, they're saying that if we just sit still here, the neighboring forts will come to help us. We can send a message out and get help, and Caesar will come back. Now, again, I know I've said this a few times now, but this is a really interesting way of kind of writing this, because Caesar is giving them the right answer, saying, yeah, you should have done this. And he's saying that some men argue this, right? So if that's true, you could say that, yeah, this is exactly what we should have done. Why would you ever leave the fort? It's kind of building that narrative of how dumb it is to actually leave the fort, because there's all these reasons on why they shouldn't do it, okay? So now at the end, we kind of have this like indirect question happening here, basically, when they ask this question then. But finally, postremo, right, they ask this question, they say, quid esse, what is, or sort of what would be, maybe even is a good way to do it, levius aut turpius, more, literally more light, but it kind of means like more foolish, light in the idea of like being like jestful or silly is kind of how it is. So what would be more foolish or turpius or more shameful than, right, capere consilium, than to adopt a plan, auctore hoste, having, with the enemy being the author of it, right, the auctore. So he's saying, what would be more foolish or shameful than to adopt a plan with the enemy being the author of this plan concerning summis rebus, the highest matters or the highest affairs. So to me, that last line to end this chapter is really a sort of nail in the coffin from Caesar of like, this is really stupid. So he just laid out to you all these reasons that all make sense of why you would never want to leave the winter fort. But this one is kind of the devastating one. On top of all the other reasons that you can see with your eyes, right? We have food, we have a fort. You can kind of think that through. But then the last question is so devastating. Why would you ever take a plan that was authored by the enemy, right? He's like, why would you ever take a plan that Ambiorix gave you and not one that I gave you, Caesar, right? A Roman. And that's really the devastating commentary that again, Caesar's inflicting on Sabinus and Cotta, right? Saying like, you've got to be kidding me. This is the dumbest thing you've ever done, right? And when you lay it out like this, it all makes sense. Again, we'll kind of see what they do and why. And the other side of it, in the next chapters, right? You're going to see that, what the response is. But this chapter is interesting because, again, like I said, Caesar's the one giving you the narrative, and he's making it seem very clear like this was a very stupid idea by them to listen to Ambiorix. Okay, so just a couple of things to think about as you work through this chapter. Again, he's mentioning Cotta by name, right? Sabinus and Cotta. He keeps mentioning who they are, and he's making sure everyone knows, like these are the people that were in charge of that fort, right? It definitely puts the blame on them, right? Although Cotta in this chapter seemed to actually have the right idea. Then you also want to notice that he's very much judging Arpaneus and Junius for believing Ambiorix, right? He's like, how could you possibly believe this story, right? Again, it's that same phrase he uses at the end, right? An enemy told you this. Why would you ever listen to the enemy? These two men are friends of Sabinus and Cotta, so it's an indirect way of saying, it almost comes off to me as like, you can't blame them for being this stupid. They're not in charge, but Sabinus and Cotta are the ones who sent them out to have this parlay. Like, it's really a judgment against Sabinus and Cotta. Okay. And again, he keeps giving you what the correct answer is: stay in camp. And he's using the words of the council to get that point across, right? You want to remember that what we get told about that council is what Caesar wants us to know. And he's telling you this was the answer and you were too stupid to actually see it. Okay. And in this debate, right? You want to look at how Caesar plays off and all this, because again, it's his sort of propaganda, right? He's telling you about himself. Some of the leaders, right, put really full trust in him and wanted to wait. That makes him look really great. So even though this is about to be a disaster, Caesar is deflecting all the blame, right? And making himself look really, really great, which is kind of interesting how he writes all these things. Okay, and again, that last line I already pointed out. Like Caesar's making a very interesting point of how dumb can you possibly be? Why would you ever follow the advice of an enemy? This is really showing though that he's writing in hindsight. Okay. Because leaving the camp is exactly what they're going to do, right? So again, the style and the sort of narrative here is interesting. Caesar kind of shapes this story in a very particular way to make it seem like there's no possible way they're going to be this dumb, and then they turn out to be this dumb. And you want to think about how interesting of a way of writing it that is, because I'm sure there were people who thought they were doing the right thing. It didn't turn out very well, but we'll see that as we go through the rest of the chapter. So always pay attention to the way Caesar's writing this and sort of the order of things and how he writes it. It really gives away what he's doing here, trying to deflect blame from himself. Okay, so hopefully that all made sense. If you have any questions at all on the translation, anything like that, feel free to put them in the comments below. I'm always happy to help you out. But otherwise, keep practicing it, keep at it, keep reading it and rereading it. And like I said, you're trying to get to a point where you can read